All right, well, here's where it's gonna start getting a little fun, as if we haven't been having fun already. But we're gonna take 3 sessions and do a flyover of the entire Bible. This is kind of like a Sunday school introduction, but for adults, because I do wanna narrow in on some pieces. We're not gonna spend a ton of time looking at individual characters, but really just the movement of Scripture and how we can understand them. We're gonna spend 2 sessions on the Old Testament. I would love to spend like 14 years on the Old Testament because it's so fascinating. It's so good. And then 1 session on the entirety of the New Testament. But the hope here is more to give you a narrative overview. So as you're reading books, you can understand how different things fit into other things. I want to give you resources and tools in terms of themes and concepts and structures that might be able to help you as you read some texts, especially texts that might not always necessarily make sense. I'll warn you that there's a lot that we're not going to get to. We're going to fly over these stories. So here are some helpful resources that are in your notebook that I do want to hand you some interesting things. One is that we have a really good timeline available here. And you can find the page numbers. They might shift a little bit as these videos go on, so I'm not going to say any page numbers, but in a table of contents in the beginning. So we have a timeline that kind of covers from creation until the end of the writing of the New Testament. And then there's a number of maps as well. The more comfortable you get with the layout of the ancient world, the more readily you'll be able to read and understand. A lot of the stories in the Old Testament, the movements of the people are defined by the geography of the land. And so we've tried to put in some different maps that can help you get a sense of where different things are located, how different things are laid out, what Israel's like, what the surrounding areas are like at different seasons and stages. One thing to note about the ancient world, and it's the modern world too, but I think it's sometimes we miss it, is the size. So if you pull up your Israel topography map from the Mediterranean, you look at kind of the scale, from the Mediterranean Sea here to Israel is only about 30 miles. And it's like from here in Plover to Wausau. You know, it's not that far. To cover the entire land of Jerusalem, this is Israel, this is a walkable area. One thing I would also point out is that the 12 tribes map, if you're a map person, I was just noticing that the map that's labeled 12 tribes, the scale is off. It's really off. It's off by like a factor of 6. So apologize for that. If you continue kind of looking at the different things that we have, we've also listed 100 top characters in the Bible. So it's 60 from the Old Testament, 40 from the New Testament. And so as you're reading, and if you come across a name and you're like, oh, I wonder if that's an important name, you can look, it's alphabetized in here in the back of your book. You can look it up, gives a summary, and then kind of where it lands in the New Testament. And then of course, in the back, you've noticed this, but we have these Bible book summary overview blueprint things that we got permission to publish in this book. And they're really, really helpful. So they tell you how many chapters, where it lands. It tells you, it says type, that's the genre. So that's a really, really helpful tool. And then it kind of gives you an overview background of the book. When it was written, who wrote it, who it was written for. And so these are really, really helpful as you're reading the books to kind of dig into. So continue to lean into this tool. We developed this tool specifically as a resource that you would be able to put on your shelf next to your Bible as you're reading or studying, and hopefully use it to supplement your study and your reading as we're going. So let's dig into the Old Testament. This is an area that I'm fascinated by. I love it. I love God's faithfulness through it. And I love the complexity of reading it and studying it. And it's been a lot of fun. So there's a summary of the Old Testament that I've really been developing over a while, and I'll give it to you here. It's the Old Testament is about God seeking. So again, God is the primary character in the Old Testament. God seeking to form a specific people for himself in a place defined by him. I would even say shaped by him. But there's a problem. Because of sin, people are agents of chaos. God's plan seeks to restore structure and order and bring peace, both externally and internally in the lives of people. So again, the Old Testament is about God seeking to form a specific people for himself in a place defined by him. But there's a problem. Because of sin, people are agents of chaos. God's plan seeks to restore structure and order and bring peace, both externally and internally. So we want to keep these 4 categories in mind as we're reading the Old Testament, but also kind of as we're flying over this. God's people. What makes up God's people? Who are they? How are they defined? How's God calling them? How's God interacting? What are they like? How are they different from other people? God's place. What is God's place? Where does he dwell? What sets it apart? I'll tell you as like a heads up, anytime garden imagery appears in the Old Testament, it's probably related to God's place. God's place is first defined as Eden, the Garden of Eden, and then you get tons of garden imagery in the temple and in the tabernacle and these different places. That's a shape of God's place. What sets it apart? How does he make it? The problem, it's one of our 4 categories. How does sin disrupt God's intention for these things? Anytime you get chaos language, you're seeing the problem at work. And then the plan. How is God going to be about bridging the problem, allowing God's people to be in God's place? These are kind of 4 questions or categories to keep in mind as we read the Bible as a whole, but the Old Testament in particular. So let's dive in. We've kind of broken this up into a couple different segments. We're going to look at them really, again, a high level. As you have questions or you want to explore this more, I do encourage you either to reach out to me and I can give you some direction or some ways, or get together a group of people and say like, hey, I was really fascinated by what we're talking about when we mentioned the Judges or something like that. Could we get together and just study it some, make some observations, develop some interpretations, create some applications? That would be a fascinating outgrowth from this. But let's just fly over it right now. So before God's people, kind of leading up to God's people, not all of Scripture is weighted equally in terms of importance. Some verses, John 3:16, are more important than other verses, like he said, Job 3:2. So not in the Old Testament, Genesis 1 through 11 are some of the weightiest. They redefine how we look at the world. And so Genesis 1 and 2, of course, reflect the creation of the world. And so you see that just in the very first verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then God spoke, and God formed the earth. And one of the things that is really worth noting is the structure of creation is a structure of forming and filling. The first 3 days of creation, God is forming the structure, and then the next 3 days he's filling it. So he forms the sky, and then he fills it with sun, moon. He forms the land, and he fills it with plants and animals. There's this formation and filling. It's really taking what is unordered chaos and bringing it into ordered goodness. And in the midst of this, God creates purpose for his people. And so verse 26 in Genesis 1, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let us create him with the purpose of reflecting who we are. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and the earth, and every living creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. I've always used this example to say the Bible is obviously the most profound book ever written because it answers the largest question we can ask: what's the meaning of life? In the first 30 verses. On the very first page, it says the meaning of life is to reflect who God is. It's to image God. It's to be created to look like him in our interactions with one another, in our interactions with creation, in our relationship with God. That's our purpose. That's what it means to be God's people. So, this is just really, really rich. One of the things to wrestle with, even in this, is what's the genre? We tend to read it as historical nonfiction, and I personally would agree that that's probably how the ancient Israelites read it as well, but I don't necessarily think that that was the primary intention of the author of Moses. I don't think that he was primarily writing this to teach us exactly what happened. I think he was writing this in a way to show us why what happened. God created. Why did he create? He created with order and structure and purpose and plans. And the unorder and chaos that we see in the world around us, it doesn't reflect God's ultimate intentionality. When we look at the world and say, God, why would you make the world this way? The answer is, he didn't. We did. When we see the brokenness and the devastation of the world, it's not because God formed it or filled it or structured it or purposed it poorly. It's because of Genesis 3. It's because of sin and the fall. So Genesis 3, of course, recounts the breaking of the world. All the structures of human history is explained in this quick narrative. Why are there hurricanes? Why are there wars? Why is there stillbirth? Why is there barrenness? Why is there family struggles? All of it relates. It's because of sin. It's because God's people ultimately broke relationship, covenant with God, and sin has entered the world. And then as Genesis 1 through 11 goes on, we get Cain and Abel and the flood and Babel. And these are just continual instances of God's people moving into more unordered, disorganized chaos. It's highlighting the problem. Human attempts at ordering the world continually fall short, and God needs to step in, and he ultimately does. He steps in by calling a people to himself. And so in Genesis 12, we get the calling of Abraham, again, in abnormally weighty passage. So, Genesis 12, the Lord said to Abraham, listen to these words in terms of our categories, go from your country, that's your place, and go from your kindred, that's your people. And if you know anything about the ancient Near World, stability was based on having a place, like your land, and people, your family, to work the land. That's how you got food. That's how you got clothing. That's how you found safety. It's your place and your people. And God says to Abraham, leave your place and your people and your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. You will be my people. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. So leave your place and your people. Go to the place I will show you to be my people. And this is part of the plan, the promise to restore the problem of the disorganized chaos in the world. So Abraham leaves, he goes, he's not a perfect character. He settles, he has sons who have sons. They're all anti-heroes. One thing that I want to stress is that there are no heroes outside of Jesus in Scripture. There are men and women who faithfully follow God, but every one of them is shown to be broken. And so just because some of these patriarchs, just because some of these incredible historical, biblical figures faithfully followed God and were powerfully used by God, does not mean that everything they do are things that we should do. There is clearly sin in their lives. So Abraham has sons. He has a son named Isaac, who then has Jacob, Jacob and Esau, and they wrestled together. Jacob's renamed Israel and has 12 sons, kind of 13, 11 different sons. Some sons have sons, they're counted as sons. But these 12 become the tribes of Israel. Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, is sold into slavery by his brothers. This kind of, as we're tracking through Genesis, sold into slavery in Egypt. He faithfully follows God and is raised to prominence in Pharaoh's court. He brings his family back into Egypt, and that's kind of where Genesis ends. There's this 400-year gap then between Genesis and Exodus, and in those 400 years, the people of God has swollen to over 1 million people by biblical accountings. And they've also been enslaved in Egypt. So suddenly God's people has grown, but they're not in God's place. And so God raises up a leader for them, Moses. And Moses calls out these plagues and these judgments by God. And many scholars have pointed out the plagues that take place in Exodus. It's this spiritual warfare that's going on. This is not judgment against the Egyptian people. This is judgment against the Egyptian gods. There's this cosmic battle of Yahweh, God, the God of Israel, showing himself to be far superior to the demon gods of Egypt. Pharaoh eventually sends the Israelites away, and God's people begin the journey to God's place, which is Israel, which is the land of Canaan. And as they're there, God gives his people the law. This is a step. This is part of God's plan. And I've said this before, but there's this incredible example of how this works out between the end of the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. And so at the very end of the book of Exodus, in Exodus 40:35, God has commanded Moses to build the tabernacle. He says, "This is my place. This is where my glory will dwell." And it says, the cloud, God's presence, covered the tent of meeting. This is Exodus 40:34. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is highlighting that problem. God is in his place, but God's people, Moses, can't come into God's place because of the problem of their unordered, sinful lives. And so Leviticus 1, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. That preposition is important there. Moses is standing outside of the tabernacle, outside of God's place, desiring to be with God, but unable to be. And of course, the book of Leviticus is the giving of the law. It's the ceremonial law, the cleanliness laws, the establishment of the priesthood, the sacrificial system. And there's something remarkable that goes on in this, because in Numbers verse 1, we get this phrase. And then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. Suddenly, because of the law, God's people are able to enter into God's place. This is part of the plan. There needs to be a bridge. This is showing that there needs to be a bridge between God's people and God's place. And in the book of Galatians, in the New Testament, Paul will argue that the law was a partial bridge. It was the beginning of the understanding that there was sacrifice necessary for God's people to be in God's place. So God's people then rebel in the rest of the first 5 books. They rebel from God. They refuse to listen to him. Even though they have the law, they're still unwilling to trust God fully, and they wander for a generation. And then we get to Joshua, who takes over from Moses and goes in and settles the land, pushes out many of the ancient tribes, not all of them, but conquers the land of Israel and portions it out to different tribes. And then we enter into the period of the Judges, which is another long, extended kind of downturn in the history of the people, this cycle of sinfulness. And so we see this cycle in the story of Judges where the people sin and rebel from God, and God sends an oppressor. They cry out to God for deliverance, and he raises up a judge or a hero for them. But as the book of Judges goes on, those heroes get progressively worse and worse. One of the worst is Samson. If you read through the book of Judges and consider the judge Samson, he was not a good dude. He did not desire to follow God's laws or God's ways, and yet God used him to deliver his people in his place. There's this constant refrain in the book of Judges, which says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and the people did whatever they seemed best." And so it's leading up to the monarchy. The people crying out and saying, "God, we need a king over us. We need someone to rule." God had anticipated this and given rules for what the kings would look like in the book of Deuteronomy. But when we get into 1 Samuel, we see the last judge, Samuel, call the first king, according to God's design and desire, Saul, who is risen and anointed to be the king over all 12 tribes, the entire nation of Israel, to push out the enemies and to represent God rightly. And yet, as all humans do, he fails to perfectly image God as God's representation over the people of Israel. And so Saul fails, and Samuel anoints another king, King David, who rises up and rules as a man after God's own heart. If you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel and you consider the person of David, the question the Israelites would have been consistently asking is not, is this our king? Because he was. It was, is this the king? Is this the one who is to rule us? Because 1 Samuel paints an incredible picture of David as a man after God's own heart, seeking to follow God and seeking to know God. But if you know the history of the Old Testament, you know that David fails. David fails to faithfully, consistently follow God, and he sins in egregious ways. That results ultimately in his nation being handed over the course of time to his son Solomon, who, over the course of his reign, checks every single box of what a king shouldn't do. If you go back and you look in Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20, there's a list of what kings should and shouldn't do according to God. And the story of Solomon's reign is him doing every single one of those. Don't acquire for yourself many wives. Don't acquire for yourself armies and chariots from Egypt. Don't acquire for yourself storehouses of wealth and gold. And yet Solomon does those things. And so as a result, the nation is split in two. After Solomon, there's a power struggle between a self-proclaimed king named Jeroboam and Solomon's son named Rehoboam. And Jeroboam splits off and becomes the northern tribe, the northern kingdom of Israel. The 12 tribes of the north become Israel. And the rest of the monarchy, the story of the kings of Israel, is one of corruption, is one of not following God. There is not a single king in Israel, in the northern kingdom, who desires to do what God calls them to do. The southern kingdom, originally ruled by Rehoboam, is 12 tribes, but includes Jerusalem. It's a larger geographical footprint. And as you read through the stories of 1st and 2nd Kings, there's varying levels of good kings and bad kings, kings that desire to follow God, but kings that rebel from God. It's kind of an up and down history of people falling away from God's law, but they're all marching towards judgment. So at the end of 2 Kings, we have God's people who were appointed in Genesis 12 to be a blessing to the nations, but now fractured and disobeying God's laws, unwilling to come under God's leadership, unwilling to embrace that bridge between God's people and God's place because of their sin. And we're left with this question: how will it play out? What's next for God's people? And how will God's judgment affect them? So in our next session, session 4b, as we continue going through this overview of the Old Testament, we'll look at God's judgment and then God's restoration of his people, and then spend a little bit of time in the history of the intertestamental period, which is something that maybe we don't talk about quite as much. So we'll see you next week.